Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous. This is the fifth in a 10-part video series in which I'm teaching you how to automate using vRealize Orchestrator. In the previous video, we took a look at how to create a simple workflow. Now in this video, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at variables in Orchestrator workflows. Our previous workflow from the previous video had no variables, but most workflows that you write will need them. So let's take a look at workflow variables. As you can see here, every variable in Orchestrator falls into one of the following three categories. There are input parameters, output parameters, and attributes. Input parameters are used to get information into your workflow. So if a human being's running your workflow, we use an input parameter to ask that person for a piece of information. And similarly, input parameters can also be used when it's not a person calling your workflow, but something like another workflow or the workflow scheduler or a external system such as vRO. But in each case, input parameters allow us to get information into our workflow. As you might imagine, output parameters are used to get information out of workflows. Now I have a little rule of thumb that I tell my beginning Orchestrator developers that works really well in the beginning in terms of helping you to avoid some of the common pitfalls I've seen working with people. So here's my general rule of thumb about output parameters. It's real simple. If you think something should be an output parameter, make it an attribute instead. Now, there's reasons for that rule of thumb, and later on in the video series I'll explain what's going on there, why I make that recommendation, and furthermore later on in the videos I'll actually tell you when it is appropriate to create an output parameter. But I've just found in my experience that students and beginning Orchestrator developers have a tendency to create output parameters almost exclusively instead of creating attributes. So in the beginning, when you think something should be an output parameter, it should probably be an attribute instead. So what's an attribute, you ask? Well, an attribute is another type of variable that's used to pass information around between schema elements within your workflows. So whereas input parameters and output parameters are used to get information in or out of the workflow, attributes are variables that live within your workflow and are used to pass information around between schema elements in your workflow. Now I actually have one more item that I've just added to this list here. There is something known as a local variable, but for our purposes right now we don't have to worry about that. What we do need to understand is input parameters, output parameters, and attributes. Now any of those three different categories of variables, when you create them, they can be of different types. Now, vRO has simple data types, such as one of the data types is number. A variable that is of type number allows you to store, you guessed it, a number. By the way, for those of you who are developers from other languages like C or C++, where you have all sorts of different types of numbers, such as integer and let's say integer, double, float, signed, unsigned, and so forth. In other programming languages, you have those fine distinctions. In Orchestrator, because it's based on JavaScript, there's just one type, and it's called number. Another simple data type is char, short for character. A char variable holds a single character. Boolean is a data type that allows you to store true or false. And again, there are other simple data types defined by JavaScript. JavaScript also has other data types that are more complex, that are object-based data types, such as string, which holds a string of characters, date, which holds a date in time. Could be the current date in time, could be a date in time in the future or the past, but a date object holds a date. The array data type is used for creating arrays. Those of you who already know about programming know what an array is. For the rest of you, an array essentially can be thought of as a table of values. So whereas normally a variable holds a single value, an array holds a bunch of values of the same type. Another complex data type is file, and there are lots of others. VMware defines data types too. And again, these are object-based. For instance, there's a data type called VC:virtual machine. As you might guess from the first couple of characters in that name, VC, this is an object type that's used in conjunction with the vCenter plugin. In fact, anytime you see VC:virtual machine or VC:host system or VC: anything, you know from that prefix that the data type, that object, is defined by the vCenter plugin, as opposed to something that begins with VCAC is defined by a completely different plugin. So VC:virtual machine is a data type. It's object-based. It's an object that stores everything that you need to know about and everything that you might want to do with a virtual machine. A VC:host system is the data type for working with things such as ESXi hosts. VC:'data store, as the name suggests, is for working with data stores in your vSphere environment, and so forth. That vCenter plugin, by the way, defines literally well over 100 different data types of this sort. The next example I have here on the screen, VCAC, that's short for vCloud Automation Center. That's the old name for a product that's now known as vRealize Automation. So it just happens to be the old name being used for the prefix still. And in the world of vRealize Automation, there is something known as a virtual machine. And VRA, vRealize Automation, needs to have its own definition of what a virtual machine is. Now we can talk later on about why that is, but the reason why I mentioned VCAC virtual machine is as you progress in your Orchestrator development skills, you're going to find at times that there may be a similarly named object, such as VC virtual machine and VCAC: virtual machine, but those are two potentially completely different definitions from two different plugins. Third-party developers that create plugins for Orchestrator will, they don't have to, but more often than not, far more often than not, they too define their own objects, which you can use as data types for your variables. For instance, the Microsoft Active Directory plugin calls all of its data types AD: something. For instance, there's AD: user, AD: computer, and so forth. So there are lots of different data types. We've got simple ones, we've got complex ones, we've got ones that are defined by VMware and plugins, and as you're going to see here in the demo that I'm about to perform, there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these. But don't worry, you don't have to know all of them, because as I'm going to show you in the demo, there's a tool called the API Explorer, which helps you to understand the different data types and the different object types as you need them. In this demonstration, I'm going to show you a tool called the API Explorer. As you can see, I'm already logged into the vRO client. If you don't know how to do that, go back to video number 3. But here we are in the vRO client, and as you can see, I'm looking at a workflow. Let me actually edit that workflow. So here's the workflow. I'll right-click and choose Edit. And in here, you'll recall from the last video when we were editing this schema element, we had a place where we could type our code. That's over here on the right side. And I mentioned briefly that there's something called the API Explorer. Now you can actually see the API Explorer in different ways. This is the API Explorer embedded in the editor. I sometimes use the API Explorer that way, but more often than not, what I like to do, let me close this window. I'm going to click Save and Close. More often than not, the way I like to run the API Explorer is to go up here to this Tools menu and choose API Explorer. There's a number of reasons why I like running it this way, but one of the main reasons is this way I can have the API Explorer in its own window, over in another window be editing the workflow, but here I have the API Explorer in its own window, and I can make it really big if I want, which is sometimes helpful. So let's see here. Let me go scrolling up here to the top, and let me clear this search that I'd done previously. And let me point out the various parts of the API Explorer. So up top here, you have an area where you can search for data types and object types that you're interested in. For instance, in the video that we just saw, there was a data type called a string. So if I type string, this search area gives me information about things in the API Explorer documentation that mention the word string. Now, before I tell you how to interpret all this, I want to talk about the left side of the screen here. Up top, you have, let me actually resize this a bit here. Up top, you have a bunch of entries, each of which is a different object. Now, the different objects have different icons, and as a way to help you in the beginning, in the API Explorer, there are tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of objects. If I were to go through here and expand all of these different sections here, you'd discover that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of objects. And admittedly, that can be a little bit overwhelming at first. So let me teach you a quick trick that I used when I first started using the API Explorer. My trick was whenever I see an entry in the API Explorer that has this type of gray dot, this gray icon, just ignore those entries for the time being. What you're going to be interested in as a beginner is these ones that have the more colorful dots. Speaking of which, as I scroll down, again, each of these is a either data type or object type. And for instance, earlier in this video series, we were doing things such as invoking via a scriptable task some JavaScript code that said system.log, and then it said, what do we log? We logged hello world. Well, you were probably wondering at the time when we were typing that code, how did I know to type system? And how did I know it was system.log? And how did I know what to pass into that method in the parentheses? Well, the answer to that is in the API Explorer. If I expand system here, what you see in this description of the system object is, on the screen right now, is all the methods that we can call on that system object. So anytime you see this solid black dot, these things are methods. Methods are kind of like actions that we can perform on the object. So for instance, the system object has, let's scroll down and find it, has a method called log. And that log method that we called before, as we saw, requires that you pass in a single string. Other methods like this one here might need multiple parameters. Other methods might require none at all. But part of why we have the API Explorers so that you don't have to memorize what all the methods are. You don't have to memorize what arguments they require. You can just look these things up on the fly. Now, we were calling the log method in that earlier video, and you didn't see me do anything with the value that method returned because this method doesn't return anything. That's what void means. Other methods might return something, such as a Boolean or a string or so forth. So this is the string object, and it is, let me scroll up a bit here, it is one of numerous objects. Now, there are lots of other objects. For instance, we said, let's search for string, and we came back with a bunch of different objects. Again, solid dot is method. So if you want to know about this particular method or that method, you could double click on them and we'll find them in here and show them to you. These hollow dots are something called properties. I'll talk about those in a moment. But again, I'm pretending I'm a beginner again. I'm ignoring these gray dot entries and for the time being these properties and these methods and just looking for these colorful dots. These are objects. For instance, there's an object called string. There's another one called secure string. Without going into super detail about that, secure string is like string, but it works like a password field. When somebody types something into a secure string, you can't see what they're typing because instead of showing what they're typing, it obfuscates by, I forget if it's asterisks or dots, but it just hides what you're typing like a password field does. But let's focus on the simple one called string. Now, if I'm interested in string, we can already see it here on the screen because I happen to be there. But if I was elsewhere, if you double click on the object that you're interested in, it'll take you in the top left to that object, and you can expand that object and find out things about that object. For instance, this object has a bunch of pop quiz time. What are these? these are methods. So the string object has a bunch of methods that allow us to do a bunch of things with a string object, including things like convert the string to all lowercase letters or convert the string to all uppercase letters. So once again, we see yet another object that has methods, but we haven't found any that have properties yet. So let's actually look at an example of that. Well, what I'm going to do is, I mentioned before something called vC::virtual machine. That's an object type defined by the vCenter plugin, and when I search for it, you'll notice I get a whole bunch of those gray dot entries that I was suggesting that you ignore. You could actually go look at this. The vC::virtual machine is the very first one here. You could double click on it and find that gray dot entry over here. The main reason why I'm suggesting in the beginning that you ignore these is because if you go to the gray dot entry, you're not going to get to what you're really trying to get to. It'll take you to another page that will take you to the page that you want to get to. But in the beginning, if we just ignore these gray dot entries, or better yet, if we have a way to make the search not return them, your life will be easier in the beginning. So the trick to doing this so that you don't see the gray dot entries is anytime you have an object type like vC::virtual machine, if you just leave out the colon when you do the search, for instance, I'm searching for vC virtual machine now, you won't get back any of the gray dot entries. So let's do that. Okay, so as you can see here, we have the object type that we're interested in called vC virtual machine or vC virtual machine, plus a whole bunch of other supporting objects that we don't need to go into right now. But let's go look at vC virtual machine. So I've selected vC virtual machine. I've actually been here previously, so let me collapse that again. I'm going to vC virtual machine, and if I expand vC virtual machine, now we see those hollow dot entries. Those are the properties of this type of object. For instance, if I have a variable that has a vC::virtual machine object in it, then I can say variable name dot name. That was a little awkward there. Let me say this differently. If I had a variable called myVM, and myVM had in it a vC::virtual machine, then in my JavaScript code over in my Orchestrator workflow, I could say myVM.name, and that would tell me the name of that particular virtual machine. Other fields will let you see things like what guest operating system is in the machine and so forth. So lots of great information available for you via these properties. As a quick aside, if you're looking for the amount of memory or the number of virtual CPUs in your VM, that's hiding down in this config property. In fact, if you wanted to know the amount of memory in that virtual machine that the myVM variable holds, you could say things like myvm.config.hardware.memorymb. That's short for memory in megabytes. We'll talk later on this video series about what I'm talking about, but for right now, I just want to give some pointers. I know some of you are probably a bit more advanced and can probably jump ahead. Sometimes finding memory and finding the number of CPUs is challenging because there's no property at the top level that has that, but if you go down the property path down through .config.hardware, you'll find several interesting properties. So vC virtual machine objects have a whole bunch of properties. So properties are like characteristics of an object. Plus vC virtual machine, if I scroll down here, has a bunch of methods, including one called PowerOnVM_task. If you remember my hypothetical variable called myVM, if myVM is holding a vC::virtual machine object, then if I, in my JavaScript code, say myVM.PowerOnVM_task, open parenthesis, and then optionally I can pass in which host I want the VM to power up on, close parenthesis, then that is going to cause the virtual machine to power on. That's the entirety of the code that you have to type to use JavaScript to boot up a virtual machine. Just variable that's holding your virtual machine, .power on VM tasks, some parentheses. You don't even have to put anything in the parentheses because the host is optional, and voila, your VM's powered on. Now, strictly speaking, that was very simple. It's just a one-liner to power on a virtual machine or power it off or install VMware tools. All of those are simple one-liners, but you can do things even more easily by using the workflows that are supplied with the vCenter plugin. For instance, there's there is a workflow supplied by the vCenter plugin. If I recall the name correctly, it's called Start VM. I may not have that name quite right, but that one makes it really easy. That workflow makes it really easy to power on a virtual machine because you don't have to know the API Explorer, you don't have to know the object model, you don't have to know the vSphere Web Services API. That's part of the beauty of the workflows that we provide, is they mask off all the complexity of what we're looking at here. So now we can learn about all the things that we can do with virtual machines. And if I collapse this here, let me actually scroll up a bit here. There's all these objects that say VC this, VC that. Those are obviously all related to, those are all objects from the vCenter plugin, but let's see, I went a little too far. Actually I didn't go quite far enough. So ignore those gray dot entries. The reason why I'm scrolling up here is I'd like to collapse the section that we're in and point out that the API Explorer has documentation for all the plugins that you have installed. So I've just been showing you what's going on in the vCenter plugin, but if you wanted to do things, for instance, if you were working with the Microsoft Active Directory plugin, it too has its own objects. For instance, there's an object that describes a user, there's an object that describes a computer over in Active Directory, and so forth. And once again, we have all sorts of properties and methods that this plugin allows us to use on a user object or a computer object to do things over in Active Directory. So for every plugin, there's documentation in here. And additionally, we haven't talked about these yet, but there are things called actions. You'll know you're looking at an action later on when you see this gear icon. But for every single action that we have defined in Orchestrator, or for all the actions that VMware has supplied, we supply hundreds by default. Every single one of those actions is defined automatically in here. All right, one last little tidbit in the API Explorer. Let me go find VM Virtual Machine again. And you'll recall that it had some properties and methods. I'm looking for the method we saw before called Power On VM Task. The thing I wanted to point out is that when you select a method or a property, down below it gives you lots and lots of information about in this case, the method called Power On. Or if you recall earlier, I was telling some of the folks listening in on this video that there's that .config property, and I mentioned that you could go to .config.hardware.memory.mb to find out how much memory is in a virtual machine. The way I know that is if you select config, it tells you all sorts of information about config, including if the config property is actually pointing to another object and that object has properties, we can use this section down below. Besides reading what it says, it has these links, in particular the return type link, that when you click on it will take you to the next level down. So when I click on the link, it's going to take me through this .config property to what's stored in there, which is something called a vc::virtual machine config info object. So let me click there. And as you can see, it's taking us to VC virtual machine config info. That too is an object that has a whole bunch of properties, including one I mentioned called hardware. Hardware gives me a description of what that object property is about, but hardware is also another object, which if I go to it, gives me information about a VC virtual hardware object. And one of the properties, as I mentioned, for a hardware object in a virtual machine is the .memory.mb property. There's also the .numCPU property, and so forth. Now, I've hopefully if nothing, have made you acquainted with the API Explorer. There's obviously a lot more to it than what I'm showing in this relatively short video, but do start using the API Explorer. It will definitely increase your ability to be a better and better orchestrator, workflow developer. So that's it for our demonstration right now. Do come back for the next video. Let's see, that'll be video number 6. And if I recall correctly, what we're going to be looking at in video number 6 is how to create a workflow that uses one of those input parameters that we talked about before. So make certain you go over to video number 6 where you'll learn about input parameters.